I'm going to give just 1 second for everyone to get logged on, and then we will get started. Perfect. Thank you all for joining us for the June RDLA webinar. We have some great speakers for you guys, some very timely topics to discuss. So I am excited for this one. For the webinar, if you would like to call in today, you can do so using this phone number and the webinar ID on the screen. If you have a question as the speakers are given their presentations, please be sure to type your question into the Q&A box, and Shannon or I or the speaker will get back to you. We are going to do our best to answer as many questions as we can live, but we'll answer some questions as well through the chat function on Q&A. A reminder for the media, if anyone is joining us, to please refrain from quoting any of the discussion from the webinar. If you would like to quote any of the panelists, we encourage you to reach out to them. We also have closed captioning available for this webinar. Please click the live transcript button at the bottom of your window to begin the transcription. We also have Spanish translation services available, so if you're interested in using that, you can click the link that Shannon has posted in the chat, and that will pull up for you. So here's our agenda for today. We are going to start with an update on the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, or ARPAH. That presentation is going to be from Lauren at Fagray. We then have an update on user fee agreements, including PDUFA, from Jamie Sullivan with Every Life Foundation. And then lastly, but not least, we are going to get an update on the U.S. formula shortage and the impact that that's having on the rare disease community from Sarah Chamberlain with PKU News. Lauren, I will go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you about ARPAH, which is one of my favorite policy topics of late and is very timely given some of the activity that's happened even as late as last night. Next slide, please. So what is ARPAH? You may have been hearing a lot about it in the news, and this is a new agency that would be modeled on DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA is famous for inventing the internet. They also invented GPS, and their mission is to develop innovative technologies that can support the Defense Department's mission. And they have been around since the 1960s and have been proven to just be very effective in driving forward new technologies and thinking of out-of-the-box solutions and really operating in a very different way than most government agencies do. The success of DARPA led to the creation of ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, and isARPAH, which is focused on intelligence community projects. And so this is a model that has worked really well and one that people think could be very helpful in the health field as well. It would be designed to support milestone-driven, high-risk, high-reward research. So this, again, this is very different than the way most federal research agencies operate. Most projects in the federal government are not necessarily milestone-driven. Just the way the funding is issued, the government is not able to say, you have to hit this milestone, and if you don't hit this milestone, you don't get any more money. It's very different from the NIH grant model or even the CDC grant model. Also, this idea of high risk, high reward, another term that's often used is to fail fast research. Basically, try something that's really audacious. And if it doesn't work, okay, well, we know that approach doesn't work. And that's in some ways just as helpful as knowing if something does work. So that's what ARPAH would be designed to do. So it would really help to fill a gap between traditional government programs can do and what industry can do right now. So has some more flexibility to be innovative than the federal government. Because they are a business, they are not going to take on things that are going to be so risky that they're likely to fail. That doesn't make sense for their business model. So this is where ARPA-H can come in and fill that nice gap between the types of research that currently exist in the health space. But make no mistake, it is intended to be highly complementary to existing agencies, including NIH. It's not intended to replace them. It really is intended to do something different and complementary and operate with its own unique culture. Next, please. Now, ARPA-H has already gotten up and running this spring, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that transpired in a minute. But the mission of the agency is to speed breakthroughs in biomedical science and medicine. It's not just to plow the same ground that's already being explored through other research projects, but really to try totally new things and see if we can make science jump forward rather than move forward incrementally. And this would be research on prevention, diagnosis, mitigation, treatment, and cures, really anything across the spectrum that could help us reduce the burden of diseases and other health conditions. Unlike some other agencies that are funding research on diseases, ARPA-H is really intended to support more capabilities, technologies, and platforms. So think things that could span across multiple diseases. So the internet or GPS are good examples of like broad-based technologies that could be really helpful for a number of applications. So maybe in ARPA-H, it could be something like gene editing that could be relevant to many different diseases, or advancements in the way that we do imaging to support diagnosis and monitor treatment. It would also support the translation of research into solutions for patients. So when I said that it should be complementary to NIH, this is a big piece of that, is taking the great basic research that NIH does. They're the gold standard for that type of research around the world, and actually take it and translate it into treatments and cures and new diagnostic tools for patients. Next slide, please. So how did we get here? It's been a really interesting policy case study to see how ARPA-H has evolved, especially over the past year, although external stakeholders have been clamoring for the creation of ARPA-H for several years now. As early as 2017, there were groups, the Suzanne Wright Foundation, a group that focuses on advocacy for the pancreatic cancer community, has been one of the most vocal supporters of the concept of ARPA-H, which was originally called ARPAH. And outside stakeholders like that foundation have been pushing for the creation of this for many years because many stakeholders saw a real need to fill a gap in the health research space. But the latest developments really kicked off just over a year ago when President Biden issued his fiscal year 2022 budget proposal and included a proposal to fund ARPA-H at $6.5 billion. So a lot of money at the time. And then in this fall, Congress started taking some serious actions towards making ARPA-H a reality. First, Representative Anna Eshoo from California introduced an authorizing bill in October. And then in November, when Representatives Diana DeGette and Fred Upton introduced their 21st Century Cures 2.0 legislation, that actually included language that would authorize the creation of ARPA-H. So some competing views on how this should be done, but general bipartisan support for the idea of ARPA-H from the beginning. Then this spring, things have really heated up. Within days of each other, Senators Patty Murray and Richard Burr introduced a Senate bill that would authorize the creation of ARPA-H, and then Congress funded ARPA-H in the FY22 appropriations package. So this is where you had a little bit of a cart before the horse, where you actually had appropriations funding creating this agency before it had actually been authorized to be created by Congress. So some interesting friction between the authorizers and the appropriators in Congress going on here. Then in May, HHS Secretary Becerra formally established ARPA-H within NIH, which is that point about location. We'll come back to that in just a minute because it's an interesting one. And then in May, that the House advanced their authorizing bill for ARPAH, the ARPAH Act. It passed out of the committee. By that point, Representatives DeGette and Upton had agreed to support Representative Eshu's bill. So there kind of been the House had kind of coalesced around this one authorizing bill and had made some edits along the way. And then just last night at about 6:30 p.m. Eastern, the full House voted to pass that authorizing bill. So exciting milestone. Now we look to the Senate to advance their bill. Next slide, please. So when you have the administration, congressional authorizers, and congressional appropriators all weighing in on this, you're inevitably going to have points of consensus and points of difference. So areas where everyone seems to agree is that the director of ARPAH should be appointed by the president, and he or she should not be required to be confirmed by the Senate. That ARPAH should have broad hiring and compensation authority, so they would be able to bring people on more quickly than other agencies. They don't have to follow traditional civil service laws, and they have more flexibility in how much they pay their employees. And that's thought to be very important in being able to recruit the right talent for ARPAH. A hallmark of the ARPA model is that you don't have staff come in and spend their whole careers there. The idea is that everyone working at an ARPA feels a sense of urgency of their mission, and part of that is that everyone has limited terms. So the director would have either a 4 or 5 year term, and then the program managers, the individuals that are actually driving the research, they would have terms of about 3 years, and all of those employees would have the option for one extension, but again, would not plan to spend their whole career there. ARPAH will have the authority, does have the authority to issue contracts, grants, cooperative agreements. They can do prize competitions and do something called other transactions, which are just a way of spending money that don't fit into any of the other buckets before. And that is an important authority because it just gives ARPAH a little bit more flexibility in how it spends money for some of this really innovative research that may not fit appropriately into the other buckets. Although I will note that most of DARPA's spending is actually just through regular government contracts. They have contracting officers who are really creative in the ways that they can spend the money. They know the contracting law really well, and so they can take those contracts like right up to the line of what is permissible under federal contract law in order to put together the most effective contracts that are really going to drive results. And then ARPAH does not have traditional advisory council requirements like you see at NIH, where an advisory council has to weigh in on the way that NIH spends their grant funding. So ARPAH would not have that. Next slide. So key points of difference. As I said, of course, all of these cooks in the kitchen, they're not going to agree on how ARPAH should look in all respects. So one of the biggest issues that you may have seen news coverage about is the question of location, of the organizational location of this, not the geographic location. And there has been this push and pull between whether ARPAH should be within NIH or whether it should be a new operating division within HHS. So on par with NIH and CDC and FDA. And the arguments for each of those are that ARPAH needs to be able to collaborate with NIH, and NIH provides the gold standard for basic research. They also have all of these really strong administrative capabilities, just HR functions, contracting functions, basic functions that you need to run an agency. NIH already has those, and so if ARPAH were placed there, it could leverage those. And that is where ARPAH is right now. Interestingly, the bill that just passed out of the House last night would create ARPAH as a separate operating division. And the argument for that is that it would give it more independence, and it would be able to interact with NIH and FDA and CDC, other agencies, as more of a peer versus being like a subset of NIH. So I don't have any predictions on where that will land, but it's an interesting policy debate to watch, and I encourage you all to follow that as it unfolds. There's also, as a part of the location question, there's a debate on who the director should report to. Right now, ARPAH is within NIH, but the director reports directly to the HHS secretary rather than the NIH director. The House bill would also have that similar reporting structure, whereas the Senate bill thinks it should be within NIH with the director reporting to the NIH director. There's also a debate about the program offices for ARPAH. This is a more recent debate that has unfolded. As NIH has set up ARPAH, they created 14 program offices to help run the agency. And some members of Congress, especially Republicans, are really concerned that this is going to make ARPAH clunky and not the small, nimble organization that's intended to be. So the House bill would actually limit those program offices to 6, with most of them being dedicated to research and development. There's also some debate on exactly how far ARPAH should be able to go with some of its award authorities, grant or contract awards. So there's some limits in both the House and Senate bill on that front. While everyone agrees that ARPAH needs to collaborate with other agencies, there's some questions on exactly how that should be done. So the House bill and Senate bill would both set up an interagency council of sorts. They have slightly different functions as outlined in each bill. And then the House bill goes on to specify that ARPAH needs to work with both the FDA and CMS, whereas the Senate bill only calls out some specifics on FDA. So those are not major differences. And I think the key point there is that ARPAH needs to be able to collaborate with others. There's also a question of funding. Right now, ARPAH has $1 billion for the fiscal year 22 that was appropriated earlier this year. Those funds are actually available until the end of 2024. And then the House bill would authorize $2.5 billion, and the Senate bill doesn't have an amount specified yet. I saw just this morning that the House FY23 bill is proposing $2.75 billion for ARPAH for next year. So we'll see where that lands. You definitely want this agency to be well funded, but there are some who were concerned about the initial $6.5 billion that President Biden proposed last year, because for a brand new agency to have that much money, it may be difficult for them to spend it effectively in a relatively short period of time. And then the last point of difference, and another one that's kind of been a fun debate in Congress, is where ARPAH should physically be located. There is consensus among the two congressional bills that this should not be on an NIH campus. The Senate bill doesn't think it should be anywhere in DC at all, which is actually a bit different from DARPA. So DARPA is not located at the Pentagon, but it's located in Roslyn in Arlington, Virginia, so just a couple miles away. Right now, ARPAH is being set up at NIH, but Deputy Director Tabak has acknowledged that it will probably end up elsewhere. So it's kind of funny right now because you have lots of members of Congress speaking up and saying, it should be in my state, it should be in my state. So far I've heard Texas, Georgia, Massachusetts, Ohio, and New Jersey raised as possibilities for this. So we'll see where it lands. And again, I don't have any good predictions on that, but it's fun to watch. Next slide. The current status of ARPAH, as I mentioned, it was formally established within NIH, and they are in the process of setting it up with those 14 program offices. In May, Secretary Becerra appointed acting Deputy Director Adam Russell. He's an anthropologist by training, but has a lot of experience working at ARPA organizations, so he understands the model, and I think is very committed to it. So although he is acting Deputy Director right now, the thought is that he will likely get the permanent Deputy Director spot once an inaugural director is appointed. And that search is ongoing right now. I think it's a little bit complicated right now because there are a lot of openings in scientific leadership positions in the government in general. Just this morning, President Biden announced his intent to nominate a woman called Arati Prahabkar to be the new director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, which is currently vacant. Interestingly, she was the first female director of DARPA, so she has an ARPA background as well. The NIH director spot is still open. So I think from the administration's perspective, they may try to fill those other positions before filling the ARPA H position, but we'll see how that unfolds. I already mentioned that the 14 program offices have been established, but those are more for support functions at this point. The program managers, the people who are going to be responsible for driving the research, for making determinations on who will receive project funding, those people are not likely to be hired until an inaugural director is in place, because the director is going to have such an influence on the overall culture and focus of ARPA-H. Next slide. So what happens next? Well, I wish I had an ARPA-H crystal ball. I do not, but some things that I think to happen is that Senate markup of their bill, I think is likely to occur before the August recess, especially now that the House has passed their bill and put some extra pressure on the Senate. And frankly, the fact that the appropriators have already given funding to ARPA-H puts some extra pressure on the authorizers to get their work done. And then the timing of negotiations between the House and Senate are still somewhat up in the air, especially with it being an election year and less legislative work getting done as we move into the fall and into the election season. But there is a strong commitment to passing this bill. And so I do expect it to pass at some point, likely later this year. There's also likely to be additional funding included in the FY23 appropriations package, which I would guess would likely be finalized during the lame duck session later this year. And then hopefully we'll see an inaugural director appointed this year and a location selected. So lots of things still to unfold as this agency gets fully up and running, but there's already been a lot of progress made in a relatively short period of time. And it's a really exciting new bipartisan initiative and really a great opportunity to advance health research and in ways that will hopefully lead to more and better treatments and cures for patients. And now that's the last slide with content, but I am very happy to take questions from the audience if there are any.
Lauren, thank you so much for that presentation. It doesn't look like there's any questions right now. I would definitely keep an eye on the Q&A in the chat because people will continue to put questions in there for you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Next, we have Jamie Sullivan with the Every Life Foundation. Oh, and Jamie is going to give you guys an update on FDAUFA. So Jamie, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm not going to use slides today. We've done several different updates and descriptions of a number of the provisions in the user fee bill. And I thought today I would just speak with you all, give you a little bit of an update on the process, talk about some of the developments in the Senate, which have occurred since last month when we spoke as well. So just in case you haven't been a part of the previous updates and you're relatively new to the user fee, just a quick level set. User fees or FDAUFA especially, is the prescription drug user fee. And they were first passed in 1992. And the law supplemented FDA with critical new resources by establishing user fees that are paid by biopharmaceutical companies, not taxpayers, to help support and enhance FDA regulatory review and infrastructure. So again, these are user fees that are above and separate from the regular appropriations process, which also does include some pretty important FDA funding as well. So this user fee process has to be reauthorized every 5 years. It started over 2 years ago when FDA invited non-industry stakeholders, including advocacy groups like ours, other healthcare professionals and other experts to participate in consultation meetings that began in July 2020 and happened throughout 2020 and part of 2021 alongside FDA's negotiations with regulated industry. So the draft of what came out of that process, those negotiations and the public engagement, a draft commitment letter, it's called, was released by the FDA in late August, detailed a framework of policy commitments from the agency with additional public engagement happening before a final commitment letter was transmitted to Congress in January, which then shifts the process to Congress. And they must consider policy priorities, pass a final user fee bill, ideally well before the September 30th deadline, to avoid a lot of other processes that will get set in motion if we get too close to September and can be disruptive to the FDA's work. So PDUFA is just one of 4 user fee agreements that are included in the final bill package. Other agreements establish user fees for medical devices, generic drugs, and biosimilars. For the most part, most of our engagement has focused on PDUFA and in some cases, the medical device space as well. So in May, the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House released the first draft of a complete user fee bill for these 4 categories, and they addressed issues that are policies that dealt with rare diseases, accelerated approval, clinical trial diversity, use of real world evidence in decentralized trials, as well as using it to reauthorize some existing programs within the FDA, like the Orphan Drug Grant Program, for example. The committee continued its work throughout May. They had a subcommittee hearing and then proceeded to have a full committee hearing and markup of the bill on May 18th. And then actually was passed the bill. The House passed the bill, which is called the Food and Drug Amendments of 2022 on June 8th by a bipartisan vote. It was pretty overwhelmingly bipartisan, 392 to 28. And now the House waits Senate action, which has really started to step up, and some cross-chamber conversations are beginning any day now. So what has happened in the Senate since we last spoke? I believe since we last spoke, we didn't have any policy updates on the House side, except for the fact that the bill passed. But in the Senate, when we last had a webinar, a discussion draft had just been released, and then following that, on May 27th, the Senate Health Committee introduced the FDAUFA Act, which is the Senate version of the user fee bill, the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Landmark Advancements, because we all like good acronyms. So after the Health Committee held a hearing on June 14th and markup of that bill, they passed the bill out of the committee and sent it to the full Senate by a 13-9 vote. And now the Senate process is continuing. The conference process is beginning, pre-conference process is beginning to try and work out some differences between the bills and come up with a final package. So because we've already covered what highlights of what was in the House package in a few different places, I'm not going to go back through that, but I do encourage you, if you haven't gone through that presentation, to view the recording of the May Rare Disease Caucus briefing, or the last few RDLA webinars as well, if you'd like an update, and we can make some public slides available as well that cover some of the highlights. So what I did want to do is spend a few minutes highlighting some differences in what was passed out of the Health Committee compared to what we had covered in the past. So one of the first major differences, the Senate included some other big issues that were not included in the House version. And one of those that's of interest to the rare disease community is the Verifying Accurate Leading Edge IVCT Development Act, which is a mouthful, but otherwise known as the VALID Act. And that would give FDA additional authorities to regulate in vitro diagnostics and laboratory developed tests. And it's a major shift in how laboratory developed tests are regulated. And there have been some concerns that raised about the potential unintended consequences of the VALID Act as it's written, including a potential to hamper diagnostic innovation, in rare diseases. The topic has been under conversation, in conversations for a number of years. The FDA has indicated, they want this ability, that Congress to clarify their ability to regulate lab developed tests. There's been a lot of engagement over kind of ebbing and flowing over the years, but the most recent iteration of the bill was put into the Senate, user fee bill without a lot of visibility from stakeholder groups prior to that happening. So I think by and large, there's a growing voice of advocates, both across stakeholder groups, to urge the Senate to not include this issue in the user fee bill because of the fact that it is a major new shift in policy and really just requires a really deliberative policy process to assess unintended consequences. It really requires more public engagement than is possible at this phase of the user fee bill. So, while an amendment was introduced during the hearing that would exempt academic centers from the VALID Act, which would help address some of the rare disease related concerns because academic labs are responsible for much of the innovation in rare disease diagnostics and what's happening, within the major institutions. The amendment didn't pass because many claimed it wasn't necessary due to the fact that there are some safe harbors for rare disease in the bill already, including an exemption for tests that are for diseases under 10,000 in population. However, concerns remain about costs, how decisions are going to be made regarding what risk classification tests will fall into, and that determines their regulatory pathway and what they must prove. And then who will qualify for the exemption? How will it be determined? And is that good enough, 10,000? When it's not aligned with the Center for Drugs definition of rare diseases, which is 200,000. So as you can see, there's just a lot of complicating factors, and it's a very complex issue. And so our hope is that this important and consequential issue is given the time it needs to fully vet policy solutions and thus not done within the realm of the user fee bill. This was not included in the House version. It is a very important bill. Everyone wants more certainty and making sure the tests that are used for diagnostics are indeed, reliable. And that certainly is an issue to address, but we just want to make sure that this is addressed in a way that does not have unintended consequences for rare disease. So, well, the Senate did include some additional proposals related to the accelerated approval pathway as well. By and large, I think the language agrees across both the House and the Senate bill, which is a good thing. But the Senate language does include some additional elements, including what is now a standalone bill introduced by Senators Collins and Senator Kane, which creates an internal FDA accelerated approval council, which is charged with coordinating across the centers, so the drug, biologics centers, and the divisions within those centers to ensure that consistent application of the pathway. So we know that the pathway has been so important to transforming oncology outcomes and is most frequently used in oncology, previously, HIV and AIDS, and has been really critical in some rare disease areas. But we know there is so much more potential there, and our hope with this internal council would be that they can share lessons and how the pathway can be more consistently applied in areas where it hasn't been to date. There's also another amendment introduced during the hearing on accelerated approval that will add transparency to the process, which I think can help with consistency, can help with public understanding, payer understanding of what exactly accelerated approval is and isn't. And that amendment, the Accelerated Approval Transparency Act, I believe is called, will require FDA to post a summary of the evidence that was, basis for the approval, including things like whether it doesn't relate to it was an advisory committee, it was an advisory committee held, and what was the rationale for determining that the surrogate endpoint was reasonably likely to predict a clinical benefit. So we are watching the accelerated approval space closely and what ends up in the final bill. But as of now, there are several positive elements of what is in the Senate bill. There's some other notable differences we're focusing on as well, and two of those are provisions that were in the House bill that will benefit rare disease therapy development that were not included in the Senate bill. And so we're actively engaging with our congressional champions to urge them to include these provisions in the final bill. One is, if you recall, the House bill included an expanded scope of the Orphan Product Grant Program, which is run from the FDA. That program is reauthorized every 5 years in this bill, and we were able to work with our STAT Act leads to take a piece of the STAT Act that would create a grant program to focus on regulatory science issues in ultra rare populations or individualized medical product development, and add that piece to the reauthorization language in the House version so that it does permit FDA to fund regulatory science issues within the Orphan Product Grant Program. And while we hope to see the authorization also increase, at the very least, we need this language to end up in the final bill because there is truly a gap in the available resources to solve these challenges. And these challenges can be, how do you design clinical trials? How do you really evaluate whether there is an effect when you have, N of one, N of a few products being developed? We have to get beyond, the answer of it's complicated and tough, and make sure we are developing an evidence base that can really power the field forward and make sure that the innovation, in regulatory science matches innovation in science and under our understanding of these diseases. So we are actively pushing both for the language to be included, but also for the authorization amount to be increased so that we can then go to appropriations and ask for additional funding as well, because the program consistently gets many more applications than they're able to fund. So what else? The other is language that is in the House bill that clarifies what sponsors can share with payers prior to product approval. So if you remember, one of the sections of the STAT Act is establishing a voluntary third-party payer program where it allows third-party payers, so Medicare, commercial payers, others, to engage with sponsors in the FDA to better understand what the full entirety of the evidence that is being developed is, and helps hopefully provide more and end up with more informed payers who will therefore have the ability to create more timely access and coverage decisions, and hopefully do so in a way that is more reflective of the full scope of outcomes that matter to patients and outcomes that have been used to base the approval on. So while we don't have language that establishes that program specifically, what there is language that clarifies what sponsors can share with payers prior to product approval, gives them that certainty that what is okay to communicate and when, and it's not a full early payer program, but providing this clarity of sponsors will certainly enable more information sharing to occur. So hopefully payers will be more fully understand the evidence base, and it can be the start to something that we can build on moving forward. And the language in the House also calls for a GAO study, which will identify the impact of the communication, the more frequent communication, earlier communication with payers, and how that information was used. And that can really help set the stage for more formalized engagement opportunities in the future, in the way that the Device Center, so Center for Devices, has established a voluntary program that is more structured early engagement with payers. And that is the program that we base the STAT Act language on. So I think those are the main areas I wanted to highlight for you. And I know that was a lot and a mouthful, but moving forward, the Health Committee did pass the bill again out of the committee. However, the ranking member, Senator Burr, did vote against the bill. It's a little unclear what that means for the process in the immediate future, but in all likelihood, conversations are starting ASAP with the House as they try and reach agreement on what a final package will look like. And, so moving forward, we are continuing to stay engaged. We're focusing on, again, urging the inclusion of the expanded orphan drug program, grant program, and payer language in the final bill, stressing our support for the other rare disease provisions to stay in the final package, emphasizing the importance of accelerated approval, in the rare disease community and monitoring, to make sure that there's no last minute changes and potential for unintended consequences for the rare community, encouraging Congress to address diagnostic regulation reform outside of the user fee bill, and then just watching for any late breaking developments that could have those unintended consequences for rare as the process moves forward. So I know much of the negotiation is happening in a small group of leaders at this stage, but we will be sure to still send around an action alert very soon, in which you can help raise your voices in your communities about what matters to rare, so that they are fully understanding of what's important to the rare community. And if you live in a state with a help committee member or member of the Energy and Commerce Committee that will be participating in the negotiations, that action alert will be even more important. So I hope you stay tuned, and early next week we'll be back in touch with more updates, and we'll just keep communicating as we go through this process. So thank you. This is really the culmination of years of engagement. It is certainly not the finish line. We know we have much more to do in the regulatory space, and we will certainly keep going far beyond the user fee bill to find other opportunities to pass important reforms like the STAT Act and other priorities that you've all advocated on during Rare Disease Week and beyond. So that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie. We also don't have any questions for this presentations, but like I said, keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A, and some may come in there.
Sure.
Awesome. Next, we have Sarah Chamberlain from PKU News. And Sarah is going to speak a little bit with you all about the formula shortage in the US and how that is impacting the rare disease community and what the solution to that issue is. So Sarah, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Caitlin. So you can go to the next slide. And I guess you can go to the next one because we've established. So I'm going to give a really brief overview of the current formula crisis. I also want to acknowledge that it was not called the baby formula crisis in this meeting, and that's for an important reason. We all know of the wider baby formula crisis, but there really is a sort of segment of that is specifically affecting rare and specifically affecting not just babies, but older children, adults, and everyone who requires. Specifically, I'm going to talk about metabolic formulas because that's what PKU News focuses on. But there are other specialty formulas also affected by this. So in this past February, Abbott Nutrition issued a voluntary recall on certain lots of Elecare, Similac, and some other products. And this was due to reports of infant death and illness from Coronabacter infection. No metabolic formulas were included in this recall, so none of them were affected by this directly by the recall. But what happened is at that point, Abbott made a decision to close the factory in Sturgis, Michigan, where these products that were recalled had been manufactured. And that meant that no additional metabolic manufacturing could happen and no products could be shipped out from that formula. So for a couple of weeks, we thought maybe, this would be okay. They'd clear it up. They'd reopen the factory. But around first, second week of March, both the patient support organizations and the metabolic dietitian to manage these disorders that require these metabolic formulas really realized it was time to make a plan for change. And part of that was that Abbott initially said, and has maintained throughout, that when possible, patients should transition to other metabolic formulas, other products, because they could not immediately guarantee that those products would be available. So one thing, and I'll put a link in the chat, a group of patient organizations launched a website that was initially just designed to keep people up to date on the situation, what was happening, when we might be able to expect formula, but really evolved into a place for people to share their stories about how the formula shortage was affecting them, and also to showcase some of the media that the issue attracted. Late April, Abbott announced that they could release emergency stores of metabolic formula that had been manufactured at the Sturgis factory, and so patients began to receive those on a case-by-case basis, free of charge from Abbott. June 4th, the Sturgis plant reopened, and although we did not have at that time a timeline for the production of metabolic formulas, and we still don't, unfortunately on June 15th, the factory had to close due to storm damage. So right now that factory remains closed. Abbott manufactures a large part of the metabolic formulas for people with inborn errors of metabolism. And so we're still sort of in a holding pattern there. If you can go to the next slide. And so the implications for the rare community, obviously a lot of uncertainty. For many patients of all ages, this can be up to 80% of their nutrition. And it is really the medical treatment for their disorders. And so not only did we have the inability to obtain new products, but there was some concern about the safety. These products were manufactured at a factory where there was a recall. And in fact, the FDA addressed that directly for metabolic patients, saying, while there may be a concern about infection, talk to your providers about whether going without this formula is worse than the risk of infection. And that is a pretty dramatic, frightening statement for the government to make. Yes, you may have this concern of infection, but without this metabolic formula, the consequences are much more dire. So consider that with your physician and make a choice. Beginning in March, the specialty pharmacies and DMEs were beginning to run out of products because they could not restock. And that meant that, as Abbott had urged in the beginning, a lot of patients began to switch to other formulas. And that is not an easy transition. A lot of these formulas are acquired tastes, and they've acquired them since birth. They've been drinking them since birth. And it's not easy to switch to a new formula. There's tolerance issues, taste issues, GI issues. And so when people began to switch and do that difficult process, it meant that the other formula companies in some cases couldn't keep up, because no one expects to be able or to have to double or triple supply overnight, which is basically what was happening. There has been risk to health. I mean, certainly some metabolic conditions, including maple syrup urine disease, without formula, they will decompensate, go into a coma, and death is a possibility. A lot of people have asked, well, can you hospitalize these patients? Well, you can, but the treatment, particularly for MSUD, when you hospitalize a patient, is formula. And at this point, hospitals didn't have the formula either, and they often still don't. And so that just led to more uncertainty. And that's where we still remain. The other formula companies have been able to increase their supply, and it is starting to level out. But that sort of hole in the market from Abbott is still pretty substantial, and there are still patients who are struggling to transition to other formulas. You can go to the next slide. So this slide, that was sort of the bad. And I don't want to dwell on that. I mean, it is a serious situation, but there's been some good implications for the rare community. And that is that, everyone's heard of the baby formula crisis, and we've worked very hard to make people understand it is not just a baby formula crisis. And so there has been increased awareness on that. There's been, CBS, Evening News, NBC, ABC have all done pieces on this. Washington Post, New York Times have done pieces on metabolic and specialty formulas in particular. So just getting the discussion out there and understanding that, formula does not just affect newborns or neonates, and that it is really a medical treatment lifelong for a huge rare disease community. We're all pretty small, but I think has been a plus in this situation. And we've also had some congressional hearings on the baby formula shortage, and had the opportunity to make clear in those hearings, and even in some of the user fee debates that were going on, metabolic and specialty formulas for rare disease were mentioned. And that is pretty rare. You know, RDLA and Every Life do a great job of doing congressional briefings specifically on rare disease, but you have to get people who are interested in rare disease to come to those. This has allowed us to have people who are interested in the larger issues that, you know, maybe have never heard of rare disease, have, you know, started to learn about it and possibly understand it, which I think is really important. If you go to the next slide. So understanding is one thing, but what does that mean for the rare disease community? You know, what does it do for us? And I think, you know, looking at the congressional hearings, I had the opportunity to speak at an appropriations subcommittee, the FDA subcommittee, and my entire statement was about metabolic and GI disorders which are treated with medical nutrition. You know, there was a grocery store manager, and there was, you know, a sort of standard dietitian who talked about, a non-metabolic dietitian who talked about neonates and their need for formula. And then we had the ability to really showcase how this was affecting the rare disease community. You know, again, there were also hearings in Energy and Commerce on specific bills which talked about rare disease. And then moving forward, looking at concrete legislation, we've been able to get into, there've been a number of bills. Some are designed to get supply into, you know, the hands of families immediately, and some are designed to prevent a crisis like this happening again. And in those latter set of bills, we've been able to get language in that again acknowledges that this is not just for infants, that this is a lifelong medical treatment for people with rare disorders. And I think that's, again, a success. As those bills are debated, they all still have infant formula in the name, I will admit, but we were able to get in language that specifies that they are lifelong medical treatment for rare disorders, which I think is incredibly important. As we've made, you know, our voices heard and people have shared their stories, and we've had media, you know, agencies have reached out to the patient community and said, let's talk about what medical nutrition is. And one thing we struggle with in passing the Medical Nutrition Equity Act or in advancing it is that it's poorly understood. People don't know why a 25-year-old is, you know, on formula. So we need to define that not only for the public, but for our legislators so they can understand that and hopefully, you know, then move forward. And we have, I mean, during my testimony, during the Q&A, a representative who'd been on the bill in the last Congress but hadn't signed on, you know, raised his hand and he said, during the break, I called McGovern's office and I signed on to the bill because I didn't really understand it before, but thank you for, you know, sharing that story. And I think we got, just out of that one opportunity, I think we got three new co-sponsors. So we're continuing to build that momentum. You can go to the next slide. And, oh, this is my, my quip that during COVID, when we were doing rare disease advocacy, a lot of us would say, well, COVID-19 kind of taught the larger world what it was like to live with a rare disease. You didn't know what it was. You didn't know how you caught it. There was no treatment or cure for a really long time. And there was an incredible amount of sort of misinformation, insecurity, and everything else. And we sort of said, well, you know, welcome to our world. This is what it's like often to live with rare disease. But what came out of that was unprecedented, you know, scientific advancement in the accelerated vaccines, a real acknowledgement from the government that this was a public health crisis and we needed to work together to solve it, public-private partnership, and, you know, some legislation which will hopefully help us deal with future pandemics if they come. And so my hope is that we can say, you know, as COVID-19 is to living with rare disease, the formula crisis may be to understanding how people who rely on medical nutrition live, you know, their everyday life and the burdens and barriers that they face. And through that, we're just emphasizing that, you know, this is not just about babies. It is about babies. Babies are important. The general formula crisis is a huge public health issue. And we just need to take that understanding and advance it to the fact that this is a medical treatment, a lifelong medical treatment for many members of our community. And also that we're not new to this. This is something that people who have inadequate insurance coverage have been facing for years, the inability to access their formula. And you can move on to the next slide, because that is my supply is not the same thing as access. We have had a crisis in supply, but the fact is that once supply resumes, the rare community who relies on medical nutrition will still have a crisis of access. And that's why we need the Medical Nutrition Equity Act to remove those barriers and help provide a federal floor of coverage for this medical treatment that affects so many rare disorders. The bill numbers are there. Again, it's a bipartisan, bicameral bill that, it was introduced in the 116th, the same bill is in the 117th. And the coverage in the bill is actually already part of TRICARE. So military families have, since the beginning of 2018, had access to this coverage. And we're really using that as a model and example of the fact that this coverage does work and can really remove those barriers to access. I think there's one more slide, which is just the links that I put in the chat. And also, if anyone has questions or wants to, talk with me about this, I'm welcome. I'm happy to accept your emails and have a conversation about it. And just thank you for the time today. And that's it from me.
Awesome, Sarah. Thank you so much for being here and for talking to us about this issue that is so important and so timely and affecting so many rare disease families. We really appreciate it. I have one question for you from the Q&A box. Someone is asking, does the Medical Nutrition Equity Act include coverage on Affordable Care Act exchange plans?
And the answer is yes. This bill has no loopholes that we can find. It is public, private, and ERISA. And that's really important. ERISA plans are self-funded plans, which are generally not covered by state mandates. So there are 35, 38 states which provide some limited coverage for medical food and formula. But anyone who has a self-funded plan, which is a majority of large employers, those employers are exempt from those state mandates. So this really lays it down for all plans, including those self-funded plans. But yes, definitely ACA plans are covered.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. I have one quick reminder for everyone before we go. Rare Across America, it's coming up soon in August, and there are only 2 weeks left to register. So if you have not registered, go ahead and do so. And if you haven't heard of Rare Across America, this event is the opportunity to meet with your members of Congress at their in-state and district offices. So these are the offices that are close to you. You do not have to travel to Washington, D.C. for this. It's a great opportunity to educate your members of Congress on the issues that are most important to the rare disease community. Let me get to the next slide. So meetings are going to be August 8th through the 19th, and your meetings will be scheduled based on your availability. So whenever you register, we ask you what days you are absolutely not available, and we try our best to schedule, get those meetings scheduled for you at a time that works best for you. Senate meetings are going to be 100% virtual. We will not have any in-person Senate meetings. But our House meetings are going to be in person. So that's exciting. We haven't been in person for a few years now. This will be the first time. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. We have a few training opportunities as well. If you would like to learn more before you go into your meetings, or if you have any questions about what to expect, this is a great time to get those questions answered and to learn a bit more. Our first training webinar is going to be on July 14th, and that is called the Share Your Story with Policymakers webinar. This webinar will walk you through how to share your story with your policymakers and how to craft that story in a way that is touching to your member, it's moving to them. So be sure to join us and get some tips from advocates who have done this many, many times. We also have the general training webinar where we will just go over general things you should know for your meetings, what your meeting structure will look like, all that good stuff. And then if you are a team coordinator, that training will be July 21st. And our team coordinators are just experienced advocates who are assigned to meetings with 5 or more advocates, just to help keep things organized and to get you all prepared. Please note, though, that the registration for the trainings is separate from the registration for Rare Across America. But you can find both of those links at www.rareacrossamerica.org. I encourage you guys to go check that out and get signed up. It's a really great opportunity to speak to your member about the challenges that you're facing as a rare disease patient or caregiver, and what they can do to help you. And if you have any questions about Rare Across America, feel free to reach out to me. My email is going to be on the next slide. And we will be hosting our next RDLA webinar in July on the 21st. So we hope that you will all be able to join us for that as well. And again, here is my email as well as Shannon's. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to her as well. I encourage you all to sign up for our newsletter. It goes out every month, and we share state and federal policy and advocacy updates, as well as resources for the community and free events. So be sure to get signed up for that, to fill out some action alerts. You can do all of that at rareadvocates.org. Also encourage you to follow us on whatever social media you've used. All of the handles are here. That is where you will get the most up-to-date updates on what's going on with RDLA and what events are coming up. So I encourage you to follow those accounts. And last but not least, a thank you to our June RDLA webinar sponsors, and a huge thank you to all of you for joining us, and to all of the speakers for coming to present for us today. All of your presentations were fantastic. So we will see you guys next month. Thank you.